My friend Chris is a United Church of Canada minister, and he's been a strong social justice advocate for years, probably for generations too. Chris, we're at that point where there are generations that follow us. He also served as the General Secretary of the World Communion of Reformed Churches, and he recently returned from a trip to the West Bank as part of an international Christian delegation. And they visited church and spent time with Palestinians, as well as with some Jewish families in Israel, and met with political leaders. And Chris is going to unpack some of the context from his years of advocacy, as well as some antidotes and insights from his time on the ground in Palestine and Israel. And then we're going to hear from Jida Musla, who was born in Bethlehem, who lived during the first and second Intifada in Bethlehem. And she worked in music education, especially with children. And she had a chance to, as a result of that experience, come to a more full and rich understanding of how traumatized those kids are. And she's moved to Canada in 2008, and she's going to be sharing some of her stories and experiences in Palestine and Israel. Following our speakers, we're going to open up to a question and answer period. Then there's going to be some follow-up ideas for all of us to take on, and we'll close with a brief word of prayer. And so with that, Anne, if we can start the sermon.
Christ under the rubble. We are angry. We are broken. This should have been a time of joy. Instead, we are mourning. We are fearful. More than 20,000 killed. Thousands are still under the rubble. Close to 9,000 children killed in the most brutal ways. Day after day, 1.9 million displaced, hundreds of thousands of homes destroyed. Gaza, as we know it, no longer exists. This is an annihilation. This is a genocide. The world is watching. Churches are watching. The people of Gaza are sending live images of their own execution. Maybe the world cares, but it goes on. We are asking here, could this be our fate in Bethlehem, in Ramallah, in Jenin? Is this our destiny too? We are tormented by the silence of the world. Leaders of the so-called free lined up one after the other to give the green light for this genocide against a captive population. They gave the cover. Not only did they make sure to pay the bill in advance, they veiled the truth and context, providing the political cover. And yet another layer has been added, the theological cover, with the Western Church stepping into the spotlight. Our dear friends in South Africa taught us the concept of the state theology, defined as theology, the theological justification of the status quo with its racism, capitalism, and totalitarianism. It does so by misusing theological concepts and biblical texts for its own political purposes. Here in Palestine, the Bible is weaponized against us. Our very own sacred text. In our terminology in Palestine, we speak of the empire. Here we confront the theology of empire. a disguise for superiority, supremacy, chosenness, and entitlement. It is sometimes given a nice cover using words like mission and evangelism, fulfillment of prophecy, and spreading freedom and liberty. The theology of the empire becomes a powerful tool to mask oppression under the cloak of divine sanction. It speaks of land without people. It divides people into us and them. It dehumanizes and demonizes the concept of land without people again, even though they knew too well that the land had people, and not just any people, a very special people. Theology of the empire calls for emptying Gaza, just like it called for the ethnic cleansing in 1948, a miracle or a divine miracle as they called it. It calls for us Palestinians now to go to Egypt, maybe Jordan. Why not just the sea? I think of the words of the disciples to Jesus when he was about to enter Samaria. Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? They said of the Samaritans. This is the theology of the empire. This is what they're saying about us today. This war has confirmed to us that the world does not see us as equal. Maybe it's the color of our skins. Maybe it is because we are on the wrong side of a political equation. Even our kingship in Christ did not shield us. So they say, if it takes killing 100 Palestinians to get a single Hamas militant, then so be it. We are not humans in their eyes. But in God's eyes, no one can tell us that. The hypocrisy and racism of the Western world is transparent and appalling. They always take the word of Palestinians with suspicion and qualification. No, we're not treated equally. Yet on the other side, despite a clear track record of misinformation, lies, their words are almost always deemed infallible. To our European friends, I never, ever want to hear you lecture us on human rights or international law again. And I mean this. We are not white, I guess. It does not apply to us according to your own logic. In this war, the many Christians in the Western world made sure the empire has the theology needed. It is their self-defense, we were told. And I continue to ask, how is the killing of 9,000 children self-defense? How is the displacement of 1.9 million Palestinians self-defense? In the shadow of the empire, they turned the colonizer into the victim and the colonized into the aggressor. Have we forgotten that the state they talked to, that state was built on the ruins of the towns and villages of those very same Gazans? Have they forgot that? We are outraged by the complicity of the church. Let it be clear, friends. Silence is complicity. And empty calls for peace without a ceasefire and end to occupation, and the shallow words of empathy without direct action, all under the banner of complicity. So here is my message. Gaza today has become the moral compass of the world. Gaza was hell before October 7th, and the world was silent. Should we be surprised that there's silence now? If you are not appalled by what is happening in Gaza, if you are not shaken to your core, there is something wrong with your humanity. And if we as Christians are not outraged by the genocide, by the weaponization of the Bible to justify it, there is something wrong with our Christian witness and we are compromising the credibility of our gospel message. If you fail to call this a genocide, it is on you. It is a sin and a darkness you willingly embrace. Some have not even called for a ceasefire. I'm talking about churches. I feel sorry for you. We will be okay. Despite the immense blow we have endured, we, the Palestinians, will recover. We will rise. We will stand up again from the midst of destruction, as we have always done as Palestinians. Although this is by far maybe the biggest blow we have received in a long time, but we will be okay. But for those who are complicit, I feel sorry for you. Will you ever recover from this? Your charity and your words of shock after the genocide won't make a difference. And I know these words of shocks are coming. And I know people will give generously for charity. But your words won't make a difference. Words of regret won't suffice for you. And let me say it, we will not accept your apology after the genocide. What has been done has been done. I want you to look at the mirror and ask, where was I when Gaza was going through a genocide? To our friends who are here with us, you have left your families and churches to be with us. You embody the term accompaniment, costly solidarity. Think of the words of Jesus. We were in prison and you visited us. What a stark difference from the silence and complicity of others that you are here. Your presence here is the meaning of solidarity. And your visit have already left an impression that will never be taken from us. Through you, God has spoken to us that we are not forsaken. As Father Rami of the Catholic Church said this morning, you have come to Bethlehem and like the Magi, you brought gifts with you, but gifts that are more precious than gold, frankincense, and myrrh. You brought the gift of love and solidarity. We feel it. We needed this. For this season, maybe more than anything, we were troubled by the silence of God. In these last 2 months, the Psalms of Lament have become a precious companion to us. We cried out, my God, why have you forsaken Gaza? Why do you hide your face from Gaza? In our pain, anguish, and lament, we have searched for God and found him under the rubble in Gaza. Jesus himself became the victim of the very same violence of the empire when he was in our land. He was tortured, crucified. He bled out as others watched. He was killed and cried out in pain, my God, where are you? In Gaza today, God is under the rubble. And in this Christmas season, as we search for Jesus, he is not to be found in the side of Rome, but our side of the wall. He is in a cave with a simple family, an occupied family. He's vulnerable, barely and miraculously surviving a massacre himself. He's among the refugees, among a refugee family. This is where Jesus is to be found today. If Jesus were to be born today, he would be born under the rubble in Gaza. When we glorify pride and richness, Jesus is under the rubble. When we rely on power, might, and weapons, Jesus is under the rubble. When we justify, rationalize, and theologize the bombing of children, Jesus is under the rubble. Jesus is under the rubble. This is his manger. He is at home with the marginalized, the suffering, the oppressed, and the displaced. This is his manger. And I have been looking and contemplating on this iconic image. God with us precisely in this way. This is the incarnation. Messy, bloody, poverty. This is the incarnation. And this child is our hope and inspiration. We look and see him in every child killed and pulled from under the rubble. While the world continues to reject the children of Gaza, Jesus says, just as you did to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me. You did it to me. Jesus not only calls them his own, he is them. He is the children of Gaza. We look at the Holy Family and see them in every family displaced and wandering, now homeless in despair. While the world discusses the fate of the people of Gaza as if they are unwanted boxes in a garage, God in the Christmas narrative shares their fate. He walks with them and calls them his own. So this manger is about resilience. It's about sumud. And the resilience of Jesus is in his meekness, is in his weakness, is in his vulnerability. The majesty of the incarnation lies in its solidarity with the marginalized. Resilience because this is the very same child who rose up from the midst of pain, destruction, darkness, and death to challenge empires, to speak truth to power, and deliver an everlasting victory over death and darkness. This very same child accomplished this. This is Christmas today in Palestine, and this is the Christmas message. Christmas is not about Santas. It's not about trees and gifts and lights. My goodness, how we have twisted the meaning of Christmas, how we have commercialized Christmas. I was, by the way, in the USA last month, the first Monday after Thanksgiving, and I was amazed by the amount of Christmas decorations and lights and all the commercial goods. And I couldn't help but think, they send us bombs while celebrating Christmas in their lands. They sing about the Prince of Peace in their land while playing the drum of war in our land. Christmas in Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus, is this manger. This is our message to the world today. It is a gospel message. It is a true and authentic Christmas message about the God who did not stay silent, but said his word, and his word was Jesus. Born among the occupied and marginalized, he is in solidarity with us in our pain and brokenness. This message is our message to the world today, and it is simply this: this genocide must stop now. Why don't we repeat it? Stop this genocide now. Can you say it with me? Stop this genocide. Let's say it one more time. Stop this genocide. This is our call. This is our plea. This is our prayer. Hear, O God. Amen.
An incredibly powerful message. I know I was tremendously moved as I was watching it. I can't imagine what it would have been like to have been in the Christmas Lutheran Church. Chris Ferguson had the privilege of being there, and is going to share some of his reflections with us on the sermon and beyond.
Thank you, Steve, and good evening or good afternoon to everybody. The background of my being there is based in the actual content and power of Munter's sermon. That the original origin of the fact that a group of 19 of us, 15 from South Africa, and two folks from the US, myself living and working in Colombia, but I'm a Canadian, and a pastor from Ecuador, ended up in that space on that Christmas moment in the midst of a genocide, precisely because what was lifted up in the sermon was that Gaza had become a moment of unveiling. And in that sense, using biblical language, that Gaza is for us an apocalyptic moment in history. Apocalypse having the double meaning of to unmask, unveil, make visible, and at the same time, the meaning of once made visible, every contour of the and structure of oppression which we live is also made visible where the light is coming in. And that the unveiling of the structures and systems and brutality of oppression and our being asleep to it, numb and unconscious of it, is fundamental to then discovering in the brokenness, as Munter said, from below, under the rubble, where the hope comes. Because the point of our delegation was in the midst, after October 7th, the Palestinian Christian community, along with all Palestinians, but particularly the Palestinian Christian community, reached out with a great deal of clarity and began to try to unveil three things that were fundamental to what was going on in the bombarding of Gaza. The first message that was sent out after October 7th was, first of all, the unveiling of the fact that the situation could not be understood from the lens of October 7th at all. And you heard this in Munter's sermon, that the understanding is that October 7th happened in the midst of 75 years and more of systemic and structural oppression under a regime of settler colonialism, that for some long time now, the Palestinians in Palestine have been trying to make visible the legal, social, and ethical work that has been done to say that not only is this an oppressive settler colonial state, but it is a state that is illegally occupying historic Palestine, and moreover, got to that place through a regime of ethnic cleansing starting brutally in 1948, and is currently structured as an ethno-state practicing apartheid. All these messages, which were said and unheard, were sent again and tried to unveil, using the figure of this didn't start on October 7th. And to ask us to begin our conversation as Christian churches. You are responding very well, they said to the World Church. You're responding excellent. We read all your press releases, and they all start by saying, we condemn Hamas and the terrible brutality on October 7th. But the press releases were shockingly, disgustingly silent on the 75 years of suffering, death, and destruction. This was the first thing Palestinian Christians tried to talk to their own kin about and unveil. The second unveiling that we see in Munter's sermon was a message that came out also and had been a message that had been gaining strength and clarity since the World Council of Churches over a year and a half ago did not respond to the willingness to hear the voices that were naming clearly the situation and the structural oppression in Israel-Palestine as apartheid. And that is the unveiling, which I think you clearly heard from Munter in his sermon, the theological unveiling. That not only is there an ethical imperative, which we have as Western churches renounced, for not standing with the oppressed and clearly seeing the situation rather only through the lens of our interfaith relationships and trying to, and through the understanding that we had to adopt a pro-Israel point of view, lest we be forsaking our understanding of Jewish suffering and our solidarity with the Jewish people, a false message, because these two realities are not in opposition, solidarity with the Jewish people and so on. But Munter's message was deeper and continues to resound. Not only has there been a lack of solidarity, there has been an active theological complicity where the Western Church, under many guises, and here we're not only speaking about extremist Christian Zionists who have elaborated an end times message of horrific proportions, saying that it's good that all the Jews gather in Israel because this will provoke Armageddon and some of these nightmare scenarios, and then Jesus will come again. Forget the crazy stuff, if you want to put it that way. The mainline Protestant and to a certain degree Catholic theology has simply been the voice box for justifying and normalizing ethnic cleansing, occupation, the seas of Gaza, and the apartheid state by creating an impossibility to allow the narrative of oppression to be heard in its own terms, by creating a theological lens that gave priority to one voice and made invisible the other voice. And as Munter says profoundly, that's on us. That not only have we been aligned with the third unveiling, which is that we have been complicit with our own governments. We know too much to pretend to say that we didn't know that the Canadian government gives military aid and sells arms or allows arms to be sold through arms permits to Israel. If for my US brothers and sisters, tell me you didn't know anything about the biggest in single blocks, the most amount of transfer of resources from one country to another, from the US to Israel, for decades and decades and decades. We have all this guilty knowledge, and still politically, we have been willing to be bullied by threats of being considered anti-Semitic, and even have stood by. We may have protested, but we're told by our Palestinian colleagues very likely when the peaceful means of boycott, sanctions, and divestment were lifted up. Anti-boycott rules are put in place in many states in the United States. The mood is certainly there in Canada, with many on college campuses and so on. The language that is simply the language of lifting up and unveiling has been politically condemned. And the church has seldom been strong enough, has not met the case to defend the right for peaceful transformation of a situation of injustice and as they say, that's the background. October 7th, then you're into the bombing of Gaza, the horrific cutting off of all means of life, water and fuel and light. And to this, there is a call out to respond, to name this for what it is. And most of the institutional churches of the world were, one, slow to call for ceasefire if they did it all. Secondly, slow if they did it all to pressure their governments. And to this day, the vast majority of them cannot allow the word genocide to slip from their lips. Or if they do, it goes out in a letter, but they do not bring to everybody the urgent call to actually stand up and say, of course, we condemn Israel in its actions. When it structures itself as it is, it structures itself as an oppressive state, this must be called out, and we don't go there. His sermon unveils for us these three complicities that we have been complicit theologically. We have been complicit theologically. And of course, we are complicit, all of us, economically, as we continue as taxpayers and others to birth. Fast forward. We heard so much. We heard that this isn't only about, and I'm ending now, this isn't only about the West Bank. It is about, we saw a totally militarized West Bank, people afraid to move out or move around. The man who sold us all the keffiyehs we happily bought to take home sent us a message to say that his 13-year-old nephew had been shot dead just leaving their school. This is in Bethlehem, to be clear. The situation is generalized. And so we also have a struggle on the legal level. And I want to say that we were told by the South African government that the delegation of churches that went there, mostly from South Africa, supported by the South African Council of Churches, was one small additional encouragement for the South African government to bring the case before the International Court of Justice. Can you believe that there was a government waiting for theological validation to take a historic move? Our voices as theological witnesses, as well as political and economic actors, is extremely important. So, yes, I had the privilege of sitting in that church, and I saw unveiled three massive complicities that must end. Theological complicity with genocide, political complicity with genocide, and economic complicity with genocide.
Thank you, Chris. And you were almost right on the amount of time you said you were going to take, which is very impressive. But what's more impressive is unpacking in a different way the message that all of us need to hear from Munther. Part of the reality also is that we have many people who've experienced the reality of the occupation in a very different way. And we're privileged that Gita is going to join us tonight. Gita is, as I mentioned in the intro, but some have joined since then. She was born in Bethlehem, lived there through the first and second Intifada, taught children music education, and learned about the trauma that they've experienced as a result of that. And Gita is going to share some of her story with us at this point.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Chris, for your passion. October 7, wow, like it's an important date that we all can recall and associate with events. But why this date? Since then, suddenly, all the Western churches started organizing sessions about it, and it heavily made its way to the Western media. And my question is, where were all these voices since 1948, when people of Palestine were under oppression and ethnic cleansing, brutal military occupation and genocide? Why is it that only when Israelis are harmed that the Western churches and media speak up? But I have to say that I am so moved by the rallies and the protests that are happening here in BC. I do have a big Palestinian flag that I wrap myself with when I go and attend those rallies. I don't take that for granted because I'm not allowed to do that in my own country, in Palestine. And I don't take this flag for granted because it represents so many stories and it reminds me of so many things. One of them is in the first Intifada. I was in grade 1 when the first Intifada started. And my 16-year-old brother got arrested because he threw a stone towards the Israeli tank. He was imprisoned for 9 months in the Israeli prison. And on the day when he was supposed to get out, we went there, like we left home around 5 a.m. in the morning. And we kept waiting and waiting. Evening came and he wasn't out, and we didn't know like whom to ask, or we were in the unknown. And suddenly he came out so disoriented, skin and bone, with a black eye. And obviously, apparently what they did is they put the same flag on the ground, and they asked him to step on it and spit on it in order to leave the prison. And every time he would say no, they would start taking turns to beat him up again and again. He refused to do so. They beat him up to a point that he was almost unconscious. This flag also reminds me of my grandparents' story. My grandparents built a house in Jerusalem in 1940s, and they had 3 kids in that same house, and the younger one was my mom. My mom was 9 months old when the Nakba happened, when the Israelis started bombing and bombing the houses of the Palestinians. My grandparents were so afraid to keep their family there. And the British military, they told them, leave your houses only for 15 days, and then you will come back after everything calms down. 15 days passed, 15 years passed. They passed away. They were never even compensated or returned to their homes. When my mom was in elementary school, my grandpa was able to take them to see their childhood home. A Moroccan Jew came out of the house. She was living there, and she said, oh, I didn't know that these homes belonged to somebody. The Israeli government gave me this house for free. And my mom, she's 76 years old now. Like every time she talks about it, she talks about it with bitterness. She's not even allowed to visit Jerusalem. And all her life, her dream was to live in Jerusalem. The same flag also reminds me of the kids that I used to work with in Palestine. And through music, I saw like things that came out of them about their trauma that couldn't come out in any other way. One of the stories that happened, it was in a school in Hebron. It was grade 1, and I played some music by Dan Gibson. If you're familiar with Dan Gibson's music, he recorded seagulls sounds and ocean wave sounds and dolphin sounds, and he put soft music on top of these sounds. So in a normal sunny day, this music should be used for meditation and yoga. And I asked the kids to draw, like wherever the music takes them, whatever you imagine on the ground, in the sky, whoever was with you. And this little boy, like all his paper was red, like he colored it in red. So I said, what did you see? Where did the music take you? And he said, I saw blood. And I saw, like thinking of the music, like where really, like how come he saw blood? And they said, whose blood was it? He said, that was the blood of my dad. He was killed in front of our home by an Israeli tank. These kids are traumatized. These kids are the ones that are joining the resistance because they have no other choice, really. I would be very surprised if they don't. They have lots of trauma that they are dealing with. Injustice and human rights violations taking place in Palestine by Israel are not hard to prove. And this is according to ICJ, human rights organizations, and many historians. People of Palestine have been living under a brutal occupation and oppression by a settler colonial, apartheid, genocidal, racist state for over 76 years. And one last bit I want to share with you. I have been living in Canada for 16 years. Throughout these 16 years, I attended so many churches from so many different congregations, and I do have an observation. Of course, it comes with exceptions, but this observation I noticed like among the Canadian churches. The way they dissect the gospel is the same way how we all consume Western food. They do it with a fork and a knife. It looks neat, it looks in order, it's clean, but at the same time, the danger from that is that you take bits and pieces and you leave out so many things that could be really important. And therefore, the Western Jesus is created with the fork and knife lens. Sometimes people care a little bit for people who suffer from homelessness. Sometimes they take care and pay attention to social justice. Many times this Western Jesus is happy to remain in his own bubble, within the walls of the church, with potlucks and bingo games. And sometimes, as we all know, they dress him with an Old Testament character and they put the modern day Israel as the core and the center instead of God. And Israel becomes the idol for them, the golden calf, all bits and pieces. And sorry to break it to you, but Christianity originated in Palestine, in the Middle East. And if you're familiar with the food in the Middle East, sometimes, like many of our dishes, you have to dip. Really, you can't eat with a fork and a knife. Like the way we eat zet or za'atar. If you're not familiar with it, what we do is we take a piece of bread, we dip it in the olive oil, and then we dip it with the za'atar and consume the whole thing wholeheartedly. And we don't leave any crumbs. As my mom used to say, this is a blessing. We can't put any of it to waste. This is not exclusive to our food. It's also how our Palestinian theologians dissect the gospel, like Mundhir Isaac, Mitri Rahib, Naim Atiq. They all do it the Palestinian way. They dip. They consume it wholeheartedly and leave no crumbs. That's why it's bulletproof. That's why I know of many non-Christian individuals who have started to listen to their sermons. And this goes too to our literature. If you read Edward Said, Ghassan Kanafani, Mahmoud Darwish. And so when Western churches cut up and leave out the piece of compassion with people of Palestine, it really bothers me. Western churches withdraw, hesitate, and even avoid the topic, even though the oppression is being done in the name of the God they are worshiping. Would you join me today and really dip a bit into the Gospels? You will see the Christ I grew up with. He's the Christ that was with the oppressed and the persecuted. He was the one healing the sick and feeding the hungry. My Christ couldn't stand seeing people losing their loved ones. Christ that supported the marginalized and countered hypocrisy straight in the face without sugarcoating. He called it for what it is. Same Christ who, even though he had a close circle of friends, he did mingle with all the other nations against all odds. Not only his own tribe. He was not neutral and he did take sides. He spoke truth to power. He laughed and cried with the people in his world. He was accessible to people when they needed him. My question for us today is, if the Christ we follow took action and wholeheartedly did all of these things and much more, shouldn't we all do the same? Please take my words as an invitation to really show who Christ really is to the whole world. In the context of genocide and apartheid taking place in Palestine, I don't see it a matter of if we should interfere, but how we should interfere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gita. It's a different reality for Palestinians, those who have experienced the brutality of the occupation that many of us have read about or heard about, some of us have witnessed. And folks, the chat box is open to take your questions. We felt that that's probably the easiest way for us to try to manage it this evening. And I guess I'm going to start off by asking Chris, if you're still there, if you might react, if you might just give us some impressions in terms of your reflections on what Gita has shared with us, especially in light of your experience with other Palestinians.
Yes, I think that what Gita has shared is profound on so many levels in terms of this forward movement unveiling. I think that it's important to say that part of the shift, and I think Gita was saying this, part of the shift is that if we're looking for now a clear focus of where our understanding really, without any Sunday school beating around the bush or unclarity, really where is the call to hear and understand the gospel of life? It is really being lifted up in that situation. What's amazing about the sermon we listened to, it was also picked up by every, as far as we can tell, and this is without exaggeration, a study was done, every major media outlet in the world, from China to Russia, everywhere, and many in the United States, including some ones you might not believe, that actually picked it up and heard it. And this understanding that the gospel fundamentally has a political content of liberation and emancipation from below was heard and understood very, very, very profoundly, even by secular commentators, and that this was one of the most incredible acts, I think, of public theology, where through the vehicle of literally preaching, like in the terms of Martin Luther King and so on, a reality was revealed. And I think what I reacted to and what Gita said is there's really two questions. One, of course, is how we're all part of actually now taking concrete action. And the other part is to how are we going to be enabling so our congregations and all of the rest of us who are asleep and benumbed by so many things actually get to the nub of what the nub of the gospel of Jesus Christ is today in a world that is massively undertaken by fear. And the answer is coming from Gaza. And so I understand Gita echoing Munter's call to a very, very clear, and she's right, that if in Palestinian society and in the global South, many people are making reference to Palestinian theological voices as being extremely motivating for a language that many others don't have about how to name what's going on around the power of empire and the complicity of the powerful. So my quick reaction, of course, is a great thanks to you, but also I think there's a double challenge, a challenge for us to understand this, as I say, not just in churchy language, forget the church part of it, but hear the gospel part of it, that there's both a political imperative, but a profound gospel imperative for us to say that if we cannot be in solidarity with the Palestinian people in stopping the genocide and moving beyond that to a pathway for their self-determination, then we're far from the gospel.
One of the questions that's come in, and I'm going to ask both of you, Gita and Chris, in terms of this, is how should we interfere? And how, and putting a more specific spin on it from my perspective, how should we interfere within our own churches?
Go, Gita, please.
I think spreading awareness is huge, because like what I notice is that many people, they really don't know, or just they know a distorted part of the picture. So spreading awareness, connecting to people from Palestine, because honestly, like they are not able to share everything. Like Israel has been monitoring their social media, has been monitoring so many things, so many of them, like they cannot even express like how oppressed they are. So like really being the voice for them, because they can't really voice out their agony and pain. Also, you know, like everything that has to do with pressuring the government, like really selling weapons is a big thing, like, you know, like sending them weapons, like, and also, you know, like things like, yeah, like I think these are the main points.
Yeah, I thank you, Jit. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I do like your word. I mean, I know that there's a different way we use that in English, but I do think that that is the point, that if we're taking this situation seriously, and by the way, when you hear people in the streets say by the thousands, by the millions, we're all Palestinians. Let's be clear that the action we're going to take in around Gaza and stopping the genocide and is an interference with empire, but it also includes Sudan, Myanmar, Congo, and the list goes on. To be clear, that there's a solidarity in the global South, that Gaza is the icon for all these movements. So we're not forgetting anybody else when we say we have to move. But I think interfere is the right word. We have to be disruptive. And I think just to peel down in our own congregations, we have to be extremely disruptive. If in the middle of a genocide, the preaching, the activities, and I think Gina was hinting about this, I mean, the preaching and the activities going on with bake sales or getting ready for Lent or whatever we're doing, if stopping the genocide isn't at the front of it, where are we? Including with direct action, when you're sitting down to prepare your taxes, are you going to send in the check or send in something that says stop the genocide because you're paid for? So there's direct action. There is being disruptive. That actually, no, the world cannot go on and everyday activities can't keep on going while there's a genocide. And by the way, there's not just one. And by the way, this has to do with the structure of oppression that is widespread. And so I would say that disruptive is a good word, direct action, and supporting all the legal efforts and really flourishing and refusing to say that there is limits on our nonviolent action. This business about boycotts being off the table, or you have to be extremely careful about calling for sanctions on Israel. This is the disruptive moment. And I think, as I say, there are websites, and I hope that Anne and Steve can help us in pointing to resources that UNJPPI, and in the US, there's other websites that lay this out very clearly about what specific boycotts we can join, the Stop Arming the Genocide campaigns around ending military sales. The United States folks have a whole series of actions, including taking their own president to court for complicity in genocide. Also an action we have to consider in Canada, that when Canada joined, was half-hearted in its support of the International Court of Justice on the one hand, and then secondly, then joined in with the cutting of the funding of the refugee agency of the UN, UNRWA, that actually moved into active complicity in genocide. And so are we going to keep on paying our taxes? Is it business as usual? I just think that my brief answer won't be enough, but that we have to actually say, sit down and work. First of all, we don't do it alone. We join groups that already exist. We share our knowledge. We cross-fertilate between groups to choose actions that are disruptive and that have two purposes. One purpose is to witness to the truth and to be in solidarity with those whose voices we're trying to amplify, and the other is actually make a difference. And sometimes we'll do the one and we won't always achieve the other, but we can never fail to do the one, to do the right thing. And as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the time is always ripe to do what is right. And so, as I say, taxes are coming up. Everything that we do that participate to the Canadian economy, which is contributing on the one hand to arms sales and complicity, and on the other hand is refusing to give the appropriate aid to people who are being slaughtered. We need to be disruptive.
Trying to mention
I'm sorry to talk long. The last thing is, for those of us who share this, I believe we have to be very active in subversive spirituality and be very active through our prayer visuals, presence in our community. If there's a community where our friends miss the fact that our churches are actively working to stop the genocide, then we're not doing our job. Where are we visible in our communities? Prayer visuals, posters, presence. How are we making that message a public message?
Steve, can I add something? Thank you,
Please.
Chris. This is really great. One more thing that I'm thinking of, that we don't have to be alone in this. Like, there are so many people from other faiths and, like from other communities that are really active about it. It will be more powerful if we join forces with them. Unfortunately, like in the many rallies that I joined, there were people speaking from all different communities except the Christian voices. There was none. And this really hurts. We need to join forces with these communities.
Gita, thank you for that. And I was going to say that as well, but I want to say something very pointed to the United Church, which in Canada, is that I would say, for instance, part of the disruption as they're doing studies about anti-Semitism and so on, is to really call out that, to wonder why, or to say that, not wonder why, to say that it's not acceptable that many of the faith interlocutors of the United Church of Canada on the national level are in fact Zionist lobby groups. And that separation needs to be made, and we need to cut off relationships with groups whose self-declared intention is a pro-Zionist lobby. And to say that's not interfaith dialogue, that's not what we're about. And we refuse to be part of that theological cover-up.
Thanks, Chris and Jita. I'm just going to mention a couple of things that have come up in the chat. One is from Leo that they held a vigil for the fallen in Gaza in his church and read "We Are Not Numbers" poems and essays, and they included huge banners with the names of the children and asked attendees to write more names on more banners. And that's an effective and a constant reminder. And in terms of interference and moving things in a slightly different direction, Mariana posted that people in Vancouver interfered by blocking the port as part of the action against arms sales. That's quite a message.
Amen.
Now there are some things that have come up in here. There is the idea of a common letter that has come up that we're going to address in a few minutes, and also. And if you could capture George's email address for the BDS strategy from UNJPPI, that would be really helpful to post into. We're going to send out a follow-up note with some information for people to use. One of the questions that has also come up, though, is do you believe that the guilt of the Western world or churches concerning the Shoah still prevents us from standing in solidarity with the people of Palestine? And Chris and Jada, feel free to tackle that one.
Jada, do you want to say a word?
Go ahead, yeah. Yeah, you go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think Susan and I, my partner and I often have these debates about whether it's best understood on the level of guilt. But when you read authors like Norman Finkelstein and so on, it's absolutely clear that the whole construct of Western complicity and Christian guilt has been weaponized as such a strong paradigm that it's hard to think outside of the guilt. So whether outside of the box, so whether or not the issue is psychological, like guilt, whatever it is, we are trapped in that paradigm. That what our theological complicity as Christians and our Western complicity in the demonization of Jews and Western culture in general is a truth, but that truth has been turned into a weapon, and we have not learned how to escape it, and it's still very powerful. So even as we speak, there are churches, and including members of our own churches, that cannot see past that the absolute lens. And as I say, I'm not sure whether the word is guilt, but it's true that it is a fixed point that there is now considered a theological and ethical exceptionalism, that we can't think past the notion that everything we do has to imagine putting the security of Jews in first place. And the problem is, that's an excellent point, but not in, and must happen, but not in first place. It's that all vulnerable peoples must be protected, as our friends in the Jewish community will be the first to say in the interlocutors we have. But I want to just quickly say that that question goes to the point that we have to move quickly to unlearn certain associations. So the state of Israel is not biblical Israel, period. The state of Israel does not represent all Jews. All Jews are not Zionist. Zionism, anti-Judaism, anti-Zionism is not anti-Judaism. These disassociations are almost impossible for us to unlearn. So I would say the whole specter of the Holocaust is still with us. I wouldn't put it as guilt, but as an unshakable paradigm that has captured us and tried to make invisible the suffering of the Palestinian people. So that what I want to do is not attack the idea of responsibility for the Holocaust, but rather, as many people say, to say never again means never again for anyone.
I'm going to add the words that my friend Susan Starkman, who was the treasurer for UNJPPI for many years and who's a very active member of Independent Jewish Voices, posted. It's important to remember that Palestinians are not responsible and shouldn't be asked to pay for the Holocaust. The Holocaust should not be invoked to shield Israel from criticism.
Amen,
And,
Susan.
Thank you, Susan. And I hope you're doing well. One of the other people has posted that for people to remember that the day of prayer service used to be known as the Women's Day of Prayer Service. It was prepared by Palestinian women this year. And again, one of the other people, somebody has posted that it's important to remember to read Decolonizing Palestine by Mitri Rehab. And from Karen Rogers, in 2009, many faith communities around the world signed on to the Charter for Compassion. Could this be a starting point to bring churches together again? And I don't know, Chris, if you're familiar with the Charter for Compassion, or Gita, if you are. It was written by
Yes,
Karen.
I think yes and no. And I want to say that yes and no deliberately, in the sense that I think this is a time where we have to lead with our no's. So the Charter of Compassion looks at a series of affirmations, understandings, and I think that reminding ourselves of the world we want is extremely important, and how we have to work together to get there. But more important now is to stop the killing and to stop the justifications for the killing, because that begins to unravel the whole structure. Whereas too often we are in the construction of the utopia we share, and we're not saying no to the destruction in front of us. So I want there to be both a no and a yes in our immediate action. And clearly we have to come together and construct a world free of empire. But it must be, I think, much more political and even rigorous than the Charter of Compassion. And it simply shouldn't remind us of our shared values, but also remind us of who it is whose voice must be listened to, which is really the message of the Christ in the Rubble. It is those whose lives who have been destroyed that will help us understand how to build a world where everybody can live.
Thanks, Chris. Catherine Anderson asked if the info being sent after the webinar could include how the United Church is complicit in its relationship with the Zionist lobby in the name of interfaith dialogue. I think that many of us in the grassroots have been told that, have not been told what I know to be true. And Margie has posted that, going back to Chris's comments about taxes, some of you are probably familiar with consciencecanada.ca and their peace tax form. So a number of things have come up. Elizabeth Rahman is posting, as a Muslim, may I suggest that churches reach out to Muslims in their community and seek ways to work together on this. And that's so very true. I know that in the peace group that I'm a part of in the greater Moncton area in New Brunswick, that over half of the members of that group, half of the active members, are Muslim. And it's been wonderful in terms of getting to know some different people, and their perspective has been really, really helpful. I'm just.
Could I add that I understand, and I think we need to press this more deeply, but I understand that the United Church of Canada at the national level is beginning to reach out to, someone can help me here because I'm slightly dyslexic and I always get my letters mixed up. But anyway, the Canadian, the Council of Canadian Muslims, or however that goes. And I think they're very open to reaching out to us, and I think that is a fundamental action. We also remember that community has been recently announced it refuses to meet with Trudeau and are taking disruptive actions. And so I think not only working with them, but learning from them in terms of next step for the churches is a very fruitful path.
I'm just scanning back through the messages, and the global Kairos movement has a link put in. And can you tell us more about peace groups? And
I mean, my work right now is quite international, so I would leave it to others on the call to talk about Canadian networks.
Gita, would you like to talk a little bit about the groups that are in Vancouver and how they've sort of coalesced and how they cooperate and work together? That might be helpful, having your perspective around that.
Yeah, so at first, like I got connected to an organization called Samidun, and this organization advocates for the Palestinian prisoners in the Israeli jails. And then after that, like they are the ones organizing like the protest in Vancouver. After that, I got connected to a group here. Like I don't think they have a name. Like they just gathered themselves in the Tri-Cities, like where I live, like Coquitlam, Port Moody, and Port Coquitlam. So they started organizing like weekly protests in front of the city hall, and they are aiming at me, like they meet with this they do meeting in the city council. And recently we started reaching out to other communities, faith communities and indigenous communities in the area. So we're just starting.
At St. James United in Montreal, we've been gathering together with a Muslim and a Jewish association for years, but it's sad that in recent times that hasn't happened when it is needed the most. I just want to scan down and check a couple of other messages. I agree about reading out to Muslims. I've attended 2 presentations at mosques here in London, and they seem to feel that they are all on their own. And Chris, Susan wanted you to know that it's the National Council of Canadian Muslims.
Yeah, that's right. That's thanks to Susan. She got that right. Thank you.
By the way, for those of you who don't know, Susan is Chris's spouse. So, folks, if it's okay, we do have some follow-up items that we wanted to suggest to people, and I know that we've been at it for almost for about an hour and a quarter, and shouldn't take much more than a few minutes to run through some of these. And Anne, if you want to pull up the PowerPoint, it might be easier for you to do that. And yes, somebody's noting that there are so many good films that are out there, and I think everybody can see the chat box, can't they, Anne? Can everybody see the chat box?
Should be able to.
Okay. Okay.
Could I make a little personal note as you're moving? The excellent films, one of the things is that Mitri Rahab, who was referenced, is the principal of or the rector of the University Dar el Kalima in Bethlehem, and they have a campus in Gaza, and they're dedicated to the arts. The campus in Gaza was destroyed, and they don't know the fate of the students. But many of the films that you'll hear, several prize-winning films, were actually produced by the students who attended the film school at Dar el Kalima. So the supporting the creativity and the voice of Palestinians to name their own reality is extremely important. So thanks for whoever mentioned that.
So we want to raise a couple of ideas for you folks in terms of, as we were planning this event and as we were talking about it as a team, we really felt that it was important to raise two different ways of responding to this. One is spiritual, and the next is through advocacy. The spiritual component that we want to hold up for you, and I think George Bartlett might be organizing something around this in Toronto, and I know there are going to be people in the greater Moncton area who are doing this, and this is going on in various places around the world. And Anne, can you, it's called Gaza Ceasefire Pilgrimage, and it's a Via Dolorosa of Solidarity. It's about for those of you who, we all know Gaza is small. It's only about 36 kilometers from tip to tip. It'll take you about 8 hours to walk that. And pilgrimage is a very traditional way of approaching a sense of spirituality, and there are many creative ways that you can approach this. So for our American friends, or for those who are still of my age and generation who sometimes think in miles, it's about 22 miles in length. So you can walk that in a day, and you can build activities around it. And if you go to the next slide, please. Somebody who's known to many of us, Omar Harami, who's the director of Sabeel, the Ecumenical Liberation Center in Jerusalem, said this about it: the Gaza ceasefire pilgrimage beckons to us as an opportunity not just to witness, but to actively engage in the pursuit of peace. Let us unite in the spirit of nonviolence, a force that transcends borders and dismantles the structures of dominance. It's not just that, it's also a way for us to connect. It's a way for us to connect with other Christians in the community, for people who have no faith background. There are Muslims who have expressed an interest in joining in this in my community, and I suspect there may be a couple of Jewish people who would be willing to go along in this. It's a wonderful opportunity for folks to come together and to spend time together, but also to drop in on various locations. And the next slide, please. Basically, the next slide just sort of outlines. It's lifted from one of the pages on the Gaza ceasefire pilgrimage, and oh, there we go. It just lays. This is one of the most well laid out websites I've come across in a long time. For those of us who have to cope with the United Church of Canada website, which I believe was named as one of the 3 worst in existence in the world, this one actually works really well. It gives you a clear understanding of the things that are really helpful in terms of pulling this event off. And it's just laid out in clear steps, and they give you all kinds of tools to be able to use it. So that's one of the things that we would ask you to consider. And not only can it be a spiritual event, but it can also be turned into a fundraising event for the people of Gaza as well. Go ahead, Anne. So in terms of advocacy, we wanted to talk about a couple of different things that have really come to the fore. Arms exports from Canada, and of course, our American friends who are with us on this call know full well the situation in the United States. And the other thing we want to call to your attention is the situation with UNRWA. And so I should have kept control of this, Anne, but I'll get you to keep flipping. Project Plowshares, that many of us are familiar with, that's part of the Canadian Council of Churches and focuses on peace advocacy. They've published a report called Fanning the Flames, the Grave Risk of Canada's Arms Exports to Israel. And of course, you can see a building that is laying in rubble in the foreground of the picture. Next, please. Fanning the Flames is It's a peace research institute at the Canadian Council of Churches. The United Church of Canada is a longtime member. Canadian firms with permits granted by the government regularly export military hardware and components to Israel. And we can go on to the next one. In 2022, Canada sent $21 million in defense equipment to Israel, including over $3 million in bombs, torpedoes, missiles, and other explosives. And we're complicit in other ways. Israel's F-35 fighter jets attack and bomb hospitals, apartments, refugee camps, and critical civilian infrastructure in Gaza. And each F-35 contains about $3.1 million worth of components that are manufactured in Canada. Let's keep going, Anne. There's a parliamentary petition, E4745, and in the chat box, we're going to list some of these sites that you can link into. And it's sponsored by the NDP, and it's calling for 4 things: the imposition of a 2-way embargo on arms between Canada and Israel, to investigate whether Canadian weapons or weapons components have been used against Palestinian civilians, to review all military and security cooperation between Canada and Israel, and to close loopholes that allow the unregulated and unreported transfer of military goods to Israel through the United States. Chris talked about how with the UNRWA situation, but Canada is complicit in terms of our arms exports, and we need to pay attention to that. Several people have noted to me also that Scotiabank is one of the largest investors in the Israeli military complex, and in terms of supporting those who are exporting arms to Israel. So you may want to think about switching your accounts from Scotiabank and letting them know that that's why you're doing that if you're part of it. But moving on to the thing that I've been shocked by the Canadian government on a number of occasions and disturbed, but nothing has disturbed me more than the Canadian government deciding to suspend its funding to UNRWA. I think most of us know that a week ago Friday, the International Court of Justice ruled that it's plausible that Israel is committing genocide. And at first I was shocked that they didn't call for a ceasefire, but as I listened to people who are much more experienced than I was, they were saying that, and I hadn't realized this at the time, that Netanyahu had threatened to pull Israel away if there was a call for a ceasefire. But the ICJ has managed to force Israel to report back in a month on several issues. But on that same day, on that very same day, Israel released a report that 12 of 13,000 UNRWA employees were involved in the war crimes committed on October 7th. 12 out of 13,000, folks. And UNRWA actually employs about 13,000 in Gaza, and 30,000 across Palestine, as well as in some of the refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan. And what did the Canadian government do? They didn't lift up the reality that there's a potential genocide going on. Instead, they focused on suspending funding to UNRWA based on Israel's report. Let's go. Next one, please. The International Court of Justice ruled it is plausible that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza and ordered the Israeli government to take measures to prevent this. The ICJ should instead that this should include the provision of urgently needed humanitarian aid and basic services. That same day that Israel alleged that the 12 of 13,000 employees in Gaza participated in the Hamas attack, that the accused were immediately fired and a thorough investigation was launched. The Canadian government has paused its funding for UNRWA based on Israel's allegations. On January 30th, just a couple of days later, Canada announced new funding to other aid organizations. But the vital work of UNRWA can't be replaced. And why it can't be replaced is not Steve Barabay's opinion or the opinion of a few people. 20 leading aid organizations, including Oxfam, Save the Children, emphasized UNRWA's irreplaceable role in Gaza as the largest humanitarian agency. They warn that the funding suspension could lead to complete collapse of the aid response in the region. Doctors Without Borders claim that the funding suspensions would contribute to more death and suffering. And if those organizations are making those claims, they are credible. Many of the organizations that are in Gaza that are internationally recognized have between 25 and 50 people, not 13,000 people to deliver aid to the 2 million who are currently displaced. Folks, we do want you to write. We want you to write your members of parliament. And there's an address there to a very brief letter from the United Church that outlines it briefly. You can add your own stuff. You know your own MPs. Let them know how outraged you are. The other thing that I would encourage you to do, as Chris and Gita have already done, is ask your church to get involved. There are so many churches that are just sitting on the sidelines these days, not sure of how to respond to this. Folks, this is a genocide. It's occurred a few times in my lifetime. Right now, we're witnessing this on a daily basis. And our churches, the ones who are called by Jesus to stand with those who are the most oppressed, so many are standing in silence, and so many more are standing on the side of the oppressors. My heart is broken. Please ask. You would not, I can say this as a retired minister now, can't I? You would not believe how much it means and how much pressure it puts on a minister for a member of the congregation to say, how come we're not talking about this situation? How come we're not praying about it? How come we're not taking action? How come we're not learning? So please ask your church to get involved. I haven't been able to keep up with what's going on in the chat box for the last few minutes.
See you later. Jad?
I see many of you are taking stands and doing all kinds of things. Please encourage your friends and your families to do that, and especially around the World Day of Prayer service. We know some of the people who've been involved in the writing of it. We know the stories. We know one of the stories that's told by one of the nieces of Shireen Abu Akleh, who was assassinated, a journalist, a well-known journalist. Many of us know the woman who is named as Nora in the document, who's a good friend of the United Church and has done tremendous work on behalf of the Palestinian churches. So please find out what's going on in your community. And if nothing's going on, why not take the lead? Why not push to have it done? If somebody wants to start a letter writing campaign, drafting a letter for others to sign on to, we now, and I don't know how easy it is for us to access the email and to send information on to people, but we can probably forward it on to people. We know how difficult it is to get our church, the hierarchy in the church, to move in terms of things. But I know that the pressure that comes from members of the congregations, especially, can have a real impact. And I can also tell you that members of parliament, when they receive letters, they do pay attention to them, especially if they're from people who they haven't heard from before. Some of them are used to people like me. But when it's a new voice, it raises a consciousness. And if it was a congregation that put together a petition and people signed it, that would be incredible. So I know that there are still messages that are going into the, Anne has put in a number of links to some of the references that I made that are in there, and they'll also go out in the mail out that we're mail out. We don't use mail anymore. We're going to send it by email. So, folks, I want to thank you most sincerely for joining us this evening. And I'm wondering if we might be able to close with a word of prayer. Oh God, your dream of peace with justice for all seems so distant in these days. Give us the courage to open our eyes and gaze upon the rubble in Gaza and the fear that grips the rest of Palestine. And as we do so, may we be given even greater strength to work for peace. Holy One, our hearts break and anger wells within us with the images of the rubble of homes and hospitals, of schools and spaces supposed to be safe. Then our hearts break even further when we see the death and violence faced by innocent children, women, and men. When we see families torn apart and know that under the rubble lie the remains of innocent children and families. Give us the courage to cry out for justice. For victims of violent acts by the military and settlers alike. For those being denied water, electricity, and medical aid. For those who are refugees long displaced from their homes, bless them with even greater courage, the courage that they need to continue, the courage that they need to hold fast to any sense of hope that they might be able to muster, a hope that comes from you, O God. Strengthen us. Strengthen us to demand that weapons of war be turned into instruments of peace, that we help break down walls of separation, that we build bridges of truth and reconciliation, that prisoners and hostages be released and allowed to reunite with family and friends so they might dance in joy, so they might be able to hold and hug one another once again. We pray that the demonizing of the others cease and be replaced by listening with care and conviction and the courage and audacity to make real change. We pray that political leaders forget their own self-interest and national interests and seek the good of all people in Palestine and Israel. Oh God, we know that as our hearts break, so does yours. May your justice dwell in the land we call holy. May your righteousness abide in the land of milk and honey. May all your people be united in compassion, in grace, and in working for your peace. Together we say, Amen. Friends, thank you for joining us this evening. And we wish you peace. We wish you a good night's rest. We wish you the courage and the audacity to keep working and to keep struggling for peace, whether it be with any of the partner organizations through UNJPPI or the Canadian Friends of Sabeel or Friends of Sabeel North America or Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East or Independent Jewish Voices or any of those other allies we know that we have out there. And if you're not sure who they are, just send Anne an email and I'm going to help her out with some of this because I'm retired. And we'll try to help you connect with others. Thank you especially to Jita and to Chris and to Anne and the rest of the team. Good night.